Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. I can see a number of people are coming in now, so get started in just a minute. Welcome. Okay, I think I'll give it a go because we do have a packed agenda and we want to make sure we get to everything. Welcome, everyone, once again. My name is Annie. I'm the Asia Regional Manager at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. It's a pleasure to be asked to moderate the session today and really looking forward to the discussion. We have a wonderful panel with us that I'll introduce in just a second. But maybe just to start, to kind of set up the context for this discussion. So as illustrated by the data we at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center have collected in our Transition Minerals Tracker, abuses of rights and environmental degradation remain a reality in transition mineral extraction, reinforcing the need for strong action by business, investors, and governments. You are all also aware of the recent report that the UN Panel on Critical Energy Transition Minerals put out, which calls for human rights to be at the core of all mineral value chains. So in light of that, this is the first part of a two-part webinar series that will discuss key developments in responsible sourcing of minerals that are required for batteries as part of a just energy transition. The webinars will look at two key regions for mineral sourcing, Southeast Asia and Latin America. Of course, today we're talking about Southeast Asia. The two-part webinar series will aim to answer a couple of questions, namely, what are the new obligations under the CSDDD or the EU battery regulation? What should companies using or manufacturing batteries do to meet their obligations to respect human rights? What impacts does transitional mineral extraction currently have in key regions? And what are investors' expectations towards companies? And what is the role of investors in undertaking human rights due diligence? So again, we'll focus today on responsible sourcing of battery minerals from Southeast Asia. And we will, in this discussion, outline the specific human rights context in the region, including a deeper dive into nickel in Indonesia, with perspective from civil society, industry, and investors. So maybe just a brief intro to the speakers. So we have with us today Pochoy Labog. He's a Southeast Asia regional researcher at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. We have Francisca Gurning, EU Raw Materials Officer, Transport and Environment. We have Sahrul Gelo Kabikila, member of Indigenous Moronene community from Kabaena Island and founder of the NGO Sagori. We have Martin Baker, Strategy Advisor for Traction Energy Asia. And last, Lucy Scott, Investment Team Analyst at Marshall Wace. So a great group with us today. So before I move to the questions, just as an overview, we will be doing one round of short presentations from each panelist. So I'll be asking them a question and they will respond within a couple of minutes. That will be one round of responses. And then we are hoping to do a round of question and answer. So I'd really encourage everybody who's in the room today to drop their questions into the Q&A function of the Zoom chat. Would really encourage everyone to drop in questions, and we'll try to get to at least a number of those in the next round. And if there are questions for specific panelists, you can make note of that, or if they're more general questions, we can take those as well. And then lastly, on kind of a housekeeping note, we do have interpretation as one of our speakers will be speaking in Bahasa Indonesian. So please make sure you select the interpretation channel that you would like to hear for the webinar. You'll find both English and Indonesian channels available to select at the bottom of your screen. If you want to hear all contributions in their original language, you don't need to select an interpretation channel. You would just stay where you are. So hopefully that's clear. Okay, so because we're short for time, we don't have too much time. I want to jump right into the questions. So maybe first to Gelo. First question for you. So you and your community have experienced the real life impacts of nickel mining directly. Could you share with us some of your experiences and what change you would like to see moving forward? Over to you, Gelo.
My name is Sahrul from Kabaena Island in the southwest Sulawesi and southeast Sulawesi. Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to say to our organizer for giving me the opportunity to talk about my experience in Kabaena Island since 17 years ago when I start facilitate the community because I'm also a member of the Kabaena Island, a member of the community in Kabaena Island. We only have about the total area about 81 square kilometers with about 3,000 people. So Kabaena to us is our small heaven. But since the existence of nickel mining, everything has changed. Currently, we have 6 active corporation or mining that sells land and 1 producing smelters using the sulfuric acid to purify ore to be nickel. So in the future, we don't know what kind of hazard that we will receive, what we will infect, because in our village, they start to use sulfuric acid. So for about 17 years ago, the land has been sold, and we only receive compensation about 1,000 rupiah per square meter. And all of the guava trees, only about 200,000 rupiah per tree. While guava, if we produce the guava, we can receive about 1 million per tree. So this is the compensation mechanism that we have received since 17 years ago in Kabaena Island. And then for the community development that they have promised us, and that those that have been realized, about 1,000 to 3,000 per metric ton per ore. While we heard that the ore prices up to dozens of dollars. So you can imagine what the local community received of the metric ton of ore that have been sold. So only 1,000 to 3,000 rupiah per metric ton of ore. So even though, despite this agreement, the experience that we see and we experience, we still need to beg to the company to receive the things that they promise us. And then from the beginning, we also have denied and reject the existence of the company. So there are many limitations, and the existence of this mining has also brought conflicts between the community members on the land as well as the corporation and the mining. So we have 2 village head that tries to go against the company, and now they are behind prisons due to their effort. I've also have my shared. So I was interrogated by the police, and as well as received some intimidation to stop my activity to facilitate the community in fighting our rights. So, and then we have seen degradation of our environment and some water resources that have been disrupted. Every year we experience flood due to the overflow of the mining pond, and it flows to the sea and have polluted the coastal area as well as the seaweed ecosystem. So we were known as a fishery community that produces a lot of fish, but this is something that we cannot do anymore because the coastal area have been polluted due to the muds and the sedimentation out of the water flow from the mining company's ponds. We also have the Bajo tribe in Kabaena Island, and they also suffer from the environmental degradation. They also receive discriminatory behavior or treatment from the local Indigenous Moronene because they are deemed as someone that come to the island. So they are being requested to not talk too much because Kabaena belongs to the Morone tribe. In addition, we also have also received some subtle intimidation as well as open aggression by the mining employees recruited from the local community. So they recruited the local people and they get them and to influence the local company to purchase their own land and trigger some fear. So if they don't sell their lands, they cannot use their lands anymore because they will excavate their land and they cannot use their land. So these are some of the intimidation and aggression that the companies have done. So economically speaking, due to the active production that the company is doing, so the employees, of course, they're happy because they still receive salary. But there are some other people who are not the employees of these companies, and they also suffer from the impact. For example, from the rising prices of the fish, where previously they can pay for only 5,000 to 10,000 per pieces of fish. Now they have to pay double, and that is also really making very difficult for those who are not working to the mining companies. So in essence, we have seen a lot of degradation and we have seen a lot of destruction in our island. And we see this as a form of gradual killing of our community. And I've also heard that there is an energy transition. For me personally, this very concept is good for the urban community. However, for us, for, for those who extract nickel, for those community around the nickel extraction company, of course, we will suffer because of this. So only those living in the urban, living in the cities would reap the production, would reap the success of this. Yeah, for those, for example, have transitioned to solar PV panel and use battery, but uh, in the expense of those living in the area or the islands extracting nickel. So in this area, I would urge the world to cut the chain of the those living around the nickels and especially the society living in this island. Apologies for those in the cities. You are the one reaping the benefit of using the electric vehicles without any pollution. However, we are suffering because of these mining practices that cannot ensure the livelihood of society in the island. And therefore, we would like to urge and request, please help us to urge our government to change the regulation about mining and environment management, not just because you want to increase the revenue and to the expense of the society. We want to have some insurance of our livelihood. We also have other potentials that can be managed, not just nickel. If the government expects to extract nickel to increase the government's revenue. So I think that's what I would like to say. Please help us. Don't let Kabaena becomes a destroyed island. in the future. Thank you.
Hello, very powerful first-hand account. I think it really illustrates the serious and real impacts that nickel mining extraction has on people, communities, livelihoods, environment. So thank you so much, Gelo, for joining us and sharing that. I'll now move to Francisca. So it's a two-part question. So maybe to you, Francisca, the first part. You've been closely monitoring policy developments at an EU level. Can you share with us the highlights in terms of new corporate obligations, including, for example, under the EU battery regulation, or other such developments at the EU level?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Annie. And yeah, thank you so much for organizing this webinar and yeah, having us here. And also thank you, Sahrul, for sharing the experience. Very important to hear yeah, your story. So yeah, Annie, as you say, the EU has passed several pieces of legislation that ramp up the due diligence obligations for companies, which can therefore enhance clean battery supply chains if they're implemented thoroughly. So TNE has followed, for instance, the batteries regulation and also the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD. And both pieces apply across commodities. And the CSDDD aims to make sustainable practices a baseline requirement for companies that want to do business in the EU. And the batteries regulation is really more focused on the battery minerals specifically, which are lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite. And yet TNE thinks that these regulations are crucial for creating more sustainable and transparent supply chains. But yet to see really the change, the implementation must be done thoroughly to ensure that these regulations truly drive change. And this means that companies need to engage with suppliers and affected right holders. Maybe to illustrate a bit what the regulation does, the batteries regulation, and what is expected of companies. So yeah, the battery regulation has been adopted in 2023 and is one of the most ambitious legislative efforts in this regard to target sustainability in the battery supply chain. And the regulation requires companies that will place a battery on the EU market to develop a due diligence policy aligned with international standards, supported by strong company management systems. It also requires to establish traceability systems to track materials back to the mine, to implement grievance mechanisms and strategies to address risks that have been identified in the supply chains. And they also, the regulation also requires to have supply chain practices verified by independent third parties. And these obligations will apply to all economic operators that will place a battery on the EU market, regardless of whether they are EU-based or international. And yeah, as I've said, proper implementation is crucial now. And this really underlines the need for proper due diligence and not shifting responsibility on other things, for instance, certification schemes. So what the EU batteries regulation has done, for instance, is that they allow companies to use due diligence schemes as a tool to support compliance, not to replace, but to support. And we also, as TNE, say that this should never replace active and comprehensive due diligence on the ground, as such schemes often just provide a snapshot of compliance at a single point in time and often overlooks ongoing issues. And it should not be a box-ticking exercise for a company, but it should really be a genuine supplier engagement with risk mitigation. And when it comes to certification schemes, TNE supports IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Sourcing Assurance, which in our review today is the strongest standard that is able to provide information transparently, and not only to companies, but also to civil society. And IRMA's strength is also that it's an equal multi-stakeholder governance being co-designed and co-governed equally by all rights holders. And also another strength is strong audits of mining sites that are also made public.
Thank you, Francisca. So maybe just a second part of the question to follow on to that. So you've also analyzed automotive company policies and practices on human rights and environmental criteria through the Lead the Charge campaign. Can you share with us how companies are performing, including maybe some good examples, as well as where gaps could possibly be filled?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up this great coalition that TNE is part of. So yeah, Lead the Charge is a global network of local, national, and global advocacy partners working on equitable, sustainable, and fossil-free auto supply chains. And also here, our main message is that automakers must leverage their influence to create sustainable supply chains, focusing on collaborative supplier relationships and also robust accountability mechanisms. And each year we publish a leaderboard, which evaluates automakers on their commitments to sustainable supply chains, responsible sourcing, and human rights due diligence. They also have chapters on fossil-free supply chains and steel, for instance. But a large bit is on the human rights angle. And on progress, for instance, you can see that, maybe generally it's EU and US automakers like Mercedes, Ford, Stellantis, Tesla, and Volvo that are currently leading in the human rights and responsible sourcing space. And what we've also seen within the last leaderboard, that actually a quick progress is possible. For instance, the automaker Tesla has improved its score by 18% on a year-to-year basis because they started mapping their cobalt, lithium, and nickel supply chains to the point of extraction, so really disclosing the percentage of material sourced directly from extractive companies. And what we've also seen is that, for instance, Chinese car makers have also improved on the human rights due diligence angle, which is due to or thanks to the EU regulation in this area, which puts this pressure to them that they have to advance. So we can see that regulation can have a decisive impact. But then, of course, there are still persistent gaps. So over 70% of the automakers still make no progress on indigenous people's rights. And also the progress on responsible sourcing of transition minerals remains overall rather minimal on a year-to-year basis, because many companies still need to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for risk in their supply chains. And they also still need to ramp up efforts to remedy human rights abuses within their supply chains. But actually, there are a lot of positive or good examples that companies can take. And this goes again back to the supplier engagement. And they should really leverage these relationships to use the significant influence over suppliers and to enhance the accountability and responsibility. And some best practices could be, for instance, that an automaker integrates environmental criteria such as water management practices into a supplier contract, or that into these contractual arrangements, they can integrate more human rights clauses that are based on the company's responsible minerals sourcing policies, but as well on the company's standalone indigenous rights policy, which a company should have. And also car makers can become a member of IRMA. So again, the Initiative of Responsible Mining Assurance, to commit to source minerals from better mining operations. And also by joining these initiatives to actively open this discussion with suppliers, to encourage them to adopt better practices and to really pave the way forward to improvement. So overall, with the Lead the Charge coalition, we can see some progress, and we really want to highlight this. But overall, we also see still a lot of challenges in this regard, where we really call on automakers to act decisively when they engage with their suppliers.
Thank you so much, Francisca. Thanks for that overview, and specifically for sharing the good practice examples, which I think are great ideas to inspire companies that they can and should make progress on these issues and be more transparent and engage more. So thank you very much for that. Moving now to Pochoy. So Pochoy, this question for you. Now that you've heard about the responsibilities and obligations of companies a bit, can you share about the state of play of business and human rights issues in nickel mining currently in Southeast Asia, maybe in Indonesia in particular, How are companies further away in the downstream supply chains of nickel in Indonesia responding to these impacts?
Thanks, Annie. It's we're hoping that the regulations coming out of the EU will have a significant impact, of course, in the state of play behavior of companies, mining companies, in the Southeast Asian region, particularly in the Philippines and Indonesia. So because there's really much to improve. So this Southeast Asia, really the story of our region. I'm based in the Philippines. So Southeast Asia is really the supplier of nickel to the world. In a way, it supplies the raw materials for the energy transition, particularly nickel. Indonesia and the Philippines are top 1 and 2 in terms of nickel production. What differentiates the two countries is the level of development of the mining industry. So the Philippines is largely extractive. Nickel ores are mined. There's a bit of processing that happens within the country, but it's the nickel is mostly shipped outside. Indonesia, on the other hand, has developed their downstream industry because Indonesia has successfully banned the export of raw nickel. So they did this through a series of regulations. And so the downstream industry is really developed. There are a number of industrial parks in Halmahera, Sulawesi, that house processing plants, smelters that refine nickel, and then they're shipped outside. So in these industrial parks, the industry is really dominated by Chinese companies. So a big chunk of the processed nickel is also shipped to China, to Chinese battery makers or battery component makers. And what we're seeing with these developments, generally governments, particularly Philippines and Indonesia, really see nickel mining as a driver for the economy. It provides revenue, provides jobs. And so regulations that safeguard the environment, indigenous people's rights, community rights are either not enforced or not implemented well. So rights and the environment sort of take a back seat in favor of revenue. And this, has a tremendous impact on the environment and rights of people, as our first speaker described, Gelo, in how he observed the impacts in Kabaena Island. So Gelo actually helped us with our research on our latest electric vehicle nickel supply chain briefing. And it's very happy to see him here share what's happening in his community. But it's the impacts are largely the same when it comes to mining, right? There's impacts on the environment, impacts on the water, both the pollution of the water and affecting access of communities to water. Deforestation is particularly in Indonesia. At least 76,000 hectares have been of forest have been cut down, and in the industrial parks, they are actually powered by captive coal plants. So these are coal plants that are not connected to the national grid, but only power the industrial parks. And it accounts for 15% of the coal consumption of the entire country. So that's sort of, for a country like Indonesia that has a just energy transition partnership, this is very alarming. And we also showed in our latest research that there has been mining in small islands in Indonesia. Gelo already mentioned mining in Kabaena, and there's mining in Bawoni. These are very vulnerable islands, less than 2,000 square kilometers, supposedly prohibited to mine in these areas because of the vulnerabilities. But there are mining concessions affecting the environment and the people. And the other impact area that we're seeing is impacts on labor, particularly in the nickel processing areas, on worker safety. There are reported deaths and injuries both of local workers and foreign workers, particularly Chinese workers in these processing plants. So that's the state of play. In terms of the companies, the buyer companies that are sourcing nickel, or that have nickel in their supply chains. So in our latest briefing, electric vehicle nickel supply chain briefing, we reached out to 21 EV companies, but only 4 responded. And their responses are not very substantial in our study. We asked about their supply chains, whether or not they source nickel from Indonesia, but the responses are still very vague and opaque. Of course, the buyers we're seeing are aware of these impacts. We are seeing more. We're hearing more reports of initiatives from these companies, electric vehicle companies. Tesla was mentioned. They had a public statement in their impact report on the need to establish no-go zones in terms of mining in indigenous people's land. There's also one battery component manufacturer that revealed the supply chain that they source from Chinese companies that are operating in Indonesia. So that's quite revealing. But there's still needs a lot of improvement in terms of transparency and company policy and practice. But there's a lot of momentum that we're seeing. A lot of groups are covering this issue, and our hope is we can put more pressure into these companies in improving their sourcing practices. I'll stop there, Annie. Thank you.
Thank you, Pochoy. I think that really paints a picture of kind of where we are in the region. And like you said, we really hope that the momentum will put the pressure that's needed on companies to improve not only their practices, but even the transparency, engagement, information sharing that we see is a bit difficult at this stage to get much of. So we really hope that changes direction. Moving now to Martin. So hi, Martin. Just wanted to ask you, we've heard some of the challenges Indigenous peoples and other communities are facing in the context of nickel mining in Indonesia. What policy interventions would you recommend at a national level? And could you potentially reflect also on how you expect EU policy developments to impact responsible mineral sourcing in Indonesia?
Hi, thanks very much, Annie. First of all, Traction Energy Asia is a Jakarta-based policy think tank focused on speeding up Indonesia's transition to clean energy. One of our projects last year was to conduct mapping of Indonesia's rapidly growing transition mineral supply chain for EV batteries. We went to several sites and came up with a batch of findings about mostly negative impacts as well as some positive impacts on the local economy, and we packaged those into some policy recommendations, which we then tested with a stakeholder forum of actors from government and industry in Indonesia. As that wasn't existing, we were surprised to find out. So in addition to the EV battery supply chain mapping, which by the way is mainly upstream and downstream, there is a midstream just being developed, midstream being the production of battery components like anode, cathode separators. Most of that is still done in China, but Indonesia is developing that sector very, very quickly. I think before I go into the policy recommendations, I think it's important to understand the context. Pochoy touched on this a little bit. It's true with the Philippines as well, that Indonesia in the last couple of years has really ramped up its ambition to be one of the world's leading economies by 2050. It's called the Visi MS, the Golden Vision, by 2045. Sorry, not 2050. Part of that is to extract as much value out of its strategic commodities like nickel as possible. and it has a slew of policies and regulations to speed up that capitalization of resources, such as and I think back Gelo in Kabaena and his community are suffering from this. There's something called a PSN, so it's a strategic national project that basically puts aside all of most of the already weak environmental and social safeguards. So that's a big problem. And where that's applied, it rides roughshod over any existing regulations about not developing in small islands, in vulnerable small islands, for instance. Also, I mean, this goes back around 5 or 6 years ago. Indonesia recognized the importance of its nickel reserves, the world's largest, to the transition mineral supply chain, and had this ambition to become a global EV battery hub, and was already talking with China, which is the largest investor in the sector in Indonesia. And most of the negative impacts are concentrated in the areas with the largest nickel reserves, in Sulawesi, Central and Southeast Sulawesi, and also North Maluku, which includes Halmahera Island. As Pochoy touched on as well, there are already 2 huge industrial estates to exploit nickel for both EV batteries and also steel. One is in Morowali in Sulawesi, and the other is Weda Bay in Halmahera. There are another 4 or 5 of these huge industrial estates planned, all of which, as Pochoy also said, are running captive coal for smelting. So all of our policy recommendations are built around addressing some of the as many of these negative impacts as possible. I mean, one way to do this is to amend this PSN, this policy around strategic exploitation of natural resources, and include due diligence in that. As Pochoy as Francesca mentioned, IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, and this is a positive sign, already has good engagement with the Indonesian government, which came out of a meeting that Indonesian government representatives had in America, and IRMA were invited. And right at this time, the first IRMA audit is taking place in Pulau Obi Island in off of Halmahera in North Maluku. That's a good sign. Another good sign is the ministry in Indonesia that's been driving the exploitation of nickel for EV batteries is the Ministry of Investment. But they already acknowledge, they already know that there's a global demand for sustainable minerals. So all of our policy recommendations are packaged around that to address what we found in our field studies, some of which Gelo has talked about. So it's not just the environmental impacts, it's the social and livelihood impacts, including actually, there aren't so many Chinese workers. They're mostly in the management positions in these industrial facilities. There's a huge influx of workers from across Indonesia. That's the biggest problem. That impacts local communities. They take a lot of the technical jobs. So our policy recommendations around building the capacity of local people to engage in this employment sector. As well, there are waste management problems because of the huge population influx, as well as health and education infrastructure issues. So, but all of that being said, there are positive signs. You know, there's been a huge rapid development over the last couple of years, huge negative impacts, but there are some positive signs. And when it comes to EU due diligence regulations, like the CSDDD or the CRMA or the battery regulation, I think it's important also to note that for Indonesia to comply, along with the Philippines, it needs, and other producer countries, it needs technical and financial support. Otherwise, you know, this will be an opportunity missed. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thanks for sharing the policy recommendations. Great to hear that you've been able to start to test some of these as well. And very interesting that you pointed out that IRMA has had some engagement with the Indonesian government so far. We hope something fruitful would come out of that. Thanks also for pointing out the internal migrant worker issue as well, and the need for local capacity building in order for these local communities to be able to respond to this kind of population expansion in these smaller remote areas. So thanks for that. And now finally, thanks for bringing in this very important perspective on the importance of investor awareness of human rights issues, and specifically focusing on the need for the respect of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, which is, as you said, not always mandated at a local level, but something that companies should strive to do over and above the local regulation. So that brings us to the end of the first round of responses by the speakers. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat, and again, please feel free to keep dropping those in. So I was just going to ask, thanks, Martin, for the translation of that one question. So maybe I'll come to that second, but maybe first to you, Pochoy, a question that came through about the Resource Center. So has the Resource Center ever tried to contact company lenders like the IFC, World Bank, to push company through its lender?
Thanks, Annie, for that question. So we have in the past, we have our company response mechanism plus, but unfortunately, we haven't done this in the transition minerals, at least the nickel mining that's happening in Southeast Asia. And that will be, you know, we're in discussions. That will be the next step, since, you know, we've been reaching out to the companies in, you know, different levels, the buyers, mining companies, also processing plants and battery makers. So this is something that we are we're discussing and you know, looking to do in the future.
Thanks, Pochoy. There's also an organization called International Accountability Project that looks specifically at development projects and their lending practices and the human rights impacts of them. So I can drop the link in. It's one of our partner organizations. I get the sense that maybe they've had some engagement with those lenders that you mentioned. So I'm happy to share a bit about that. And then there was a question in Bahasa that I think Martin kindly translated. So I'll just summarize it. It's about IRMA. So how important is IRMA's influence to implement violations of the rights of our member workers in Morowali, in the Morowali Industrial Park? In Morowali, the number of work accidents is very high, and the neglect of existing rules or regulations is also high. How can EU due diligence regulations apply to Chinese companies in the IMIP area in particular? I'm not sure who wants to take this one. Martin, Pochoy.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it will be a slow process. I think we and others, because of the good engagement that IRMA has with Indonesia's government so far, think that's the best place to start. But we know that, I mean, IRMA are just conducting their first formal audit here after doing they were invited to do a voluntary audit of the Ministry of Investment and mining practices, but that wasn't that didn't include any on the ground visits. You know, that was a review of policies and things. So I mean, I think IRMA is the best chance, but in terms of how it could address issues that come up in industrial parks where there are many Chinese operations, that being the biggest investor, I think that'll be, you know, that we'll have to see how that goes in practice. But it's also important to note that, and of course there'll be questions around the differing standards, but China is developing voluntary due diligence regulations around its EV battery operations overseas. So that might be that might also be an opportunity. So that would be a sign to many organizations working on this issue in Indonesia, for instance, to open up channels in China to pick that up, because it doesn't work from afar. You have to engage with you can't shout from afar. You have to engage with China on the ground, so to speak. But I'm sorry I can't answer very clearly, Nikasi, but you know, many organizations do think IMIP offers the best chance. The EU battery regulation, for instance, is a very comprehensive regulation. It's very detailed, and it has a long implementation period. As far as I understand, because it's very complicated. As I said, I think it would help a lot if the EU provided a lot more information about the kind of technical and financial support that would support Indonesia and other producer countries to comply with the regulation. That's it. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Martin. Maybe to almost perhaps our last question that's just come in about stakeholder engagement, and I think that's a really important one. So the question is how the stakeholder engagement is going on at the level of production companies in terms of collaboration among governments, civil society, NGOs. Currently, the audit on nickel production sites in Indonesia is happening. Would watchdog organizations, civil society, NGOs be allowed to be a part of the initiative? At least regarding information transparency. So I'm not sure, maybe Pochoy, any experiences on stakeholder engagement and how involved different stakeholder groups have been?
Sorry, Annie, is this in with regards to Indonesia in particular?
Yeah, the question's about Indonesia. Yeah, so I think the audits are kind of happening, but how inclusive are they or transparent?
So we're just hearing some reports from our partner organizations, and I'm not even sure if you know, these are we can disclose the companies that are involved. But from what we're gathering, companies are, you know, doing a bit of consultations on the ground, consulting at least local CSOs. I'm not too sure if affected communities are part of the consultations. But I mean, these are all reports, and not very out in the open, not very transparent. But I mean, at least these things are being done, and it's a start. I don't know, Martin, if you've been hearing anything from the ground also.
Sorry, Pochoy, could you say again?
I don't know if you've I was just asking if you've heard of these reports also, that companies are doing their consulting of CSOs, local CSOs.
We haven't heard anything about that yet. I mean, hopefully it's starting to happen, but we haven't had any reports yet, Pochoy.
Thanks, Pochoy. Thanks, Martin. So yeah, we're coming down to the last couple of minutes, so maybe I'll try to condense the last two questions that have come in. So one is about initiatives to review the risk-based business licensing as mandated by Cipta Kerja law in Indonesia to see how the specific sector is complying. And then a question from someone from Accountability Council. This is for Lucy. From the alternative investors' perspective, are there any aspects of the stakeholder engagement or environmental and social standards you impose on project companies that would stop the investment altogether if it's not meant, or are they rather soft standards? And the question is asked because an effective project level grievance mechanism or true FPIC are rarely implemented in practice. Maybe over to you, Lucy, on that one.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Last minute or so, I just want to pass back over to each of the panelists for a very brief conclusion and maybe a quick call to action from each of you, and then we can close out the webinar. Thank you so much. Maybe in the same order. So, Gelo, if you'd like to go first, otherwise we can go to Pochoy. Last 1 minute.
Terima kasih. Saya kira saya hanya mengulangi lagi harapan kami sebagai masyarakat di pulau-pulau kecil penghasil nikel itu agar masyarakat dunia bisa membantu kami dengan cara tidak lagi membeli produk-produk yang berasal dari yang bahan bakunya dari wilayah-wilayah yang seperti kami yang bermasalah itu. Saya kira itu yang bisa. Dan karena ini pemerintahan baru, kami berharap bahwa pemerintah baru ini yang hadir, pemerintah Indonesia yang baru ini bisa mengeluarkan kebijakan yang betul-betul melindungi hak-hak masyarakat yang masyarakat adat, masyarakat terpencil, kemudian masyarakat yang berada di pulau-pulau kecil. Apalagi terkait dengan rencana mereka melakukan transisi energi itu. Saya kira itu yang bisa saya sampaikan. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Gelo. Pochoy?
Thanks, Annie. Yes, just very quickly, I'd like to reiterate that in the transition to renewable energy, our hope is that we do this without sacrificing human rights, respecting the environment, and that that should be implemented throughout the supply chains of companies. So that includes the extraction of minerals, and this is really a responsibility of the buyer companies, and we'd like to double down on that. Cannot brush aside the real impacts that are happening in the countries like Indonesia and the Philippines. And there are real impacts of nickel mining. Thank you.
Thanks, Pochoy. Francesca, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this very interesting webinar. Yeah, from my side, I'd say that, yeah, important regulation in the EU has been passed, and now it's really important to implement quickly. Also, maybe just on the question earlier from Nikasi on the enforcement and also what they will do with, Chinese companies in that sense. So everybody, every company, every battery operator will have to have their due diligence systems verified by an independent party, and there will also be market surveillance authorities to check the compliance. And as I said, now it's early to implement these provisions quickly, which will require this active engagement from companies, and they should really see a due diligence as this ongoing collaborative approach throughout the entire supply chain, and really work with the suppliers instead of just cascading responsibilities onto them. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Martin, followed by Lucy. Thanks.
Thanks very much for organising this. It's been very interesting, and I hope to continue collaboration with Business Human Rights and TNE and others on this important issue. I think the big hope is that the new Indonesian administration builds on its understanding that the world is demanding, especially Europe, sustainable batteries for EV transport, and if they don't comply, there's no market. Also, from the EU side, you know, the demand, I think the EU already knows this from its learnings from the EU deforestation regulation, which has been delayed. The EU needs to provide all of the technical and necessary financial support that is needed for Indonesia to comply. And you know, there are small positive signs like Irma's positive engagement, China developing its due diligence regulations, Indonesia's government's recognition of the global demand for sustainable products. I think that's it. Thank you.